You'll notice Soviet ammunition looks somewhat different from NATO's. They're green, while NATO's are a dull yellow color. That's not just a simple coloring they used to tell them apart. Actually, the shell casings of both historic military powers are made of different materials. The Western ones are made of brass, while the Soviet ones are made of pure steel. But why steel casings? Shouldn't they be heavier and useless for making ammunition? And if they're made of steel, why are they green? Also, why did people say that this ammunition was poisoned? Well, the answer to these questions will take us on a journey through a great industrial war between both ways of making ammunition, economic studies, and of course, a lot of military history. So you'd better get comfortable and welcome to Guns Club. In 1914, the rise of the most influential nation of the 20th century began, the Soviet Union. The Revolution of 1914 and the subsequent establishment of the Soviet Union in 1922 meant that the new Soviet government inherited a large army of approximately 5 million professional soldiers. But these men, who were also demobilized, actually had very poor equipment. Similarly, Soviet military investment in the 1920s and 1930s was enormous, investing not only in military research, but also in the modernization and expansion of the production of already existing weapons. In the 1920s, ammunition production also received a major boost, and it was expected that now, with the new advanced production lines, the production costs of ammunition would be drastically reduced. However, to the surprise of the Soviet High Command, in fact, the opposite happened. The costs not only remained unchanged. The reason was curious. Massive investment in new industries boosted demand, making some materials harder to find in the Soviet Union. Copper and zinc prices rose significantly during this period. The brass used to make ammunition, both in the Soviet Union and in the West, was an alloy of these two materials. Their very low cost and malleability made them ideal for ammunition. However, the prices of brass ammunition in the Soviet Union were twice as high as those in the West, despite being made in the same way and with similar infrastructure. Boosting brass production proved costlier than seeking alternatives. This led the Soviets to look for a way to replace the brass in the casings with another material. Many were considered, but steel was the solution. This material was largely unsuitable for casings due to its cost, greater difficulty to work with, and other disadvantages to be discussed later. On paper, they made it impossible to make casings from this material. However, steel production also grew exponentially in the Soviet Union during the late 1920s, making steel much cheaper than in the West. Much cheaper than brass. So it made much more sense to use this material, which was not volatile at all nor susceptible to market changes for local production. Likewise, the Soviet Union began to include steel in ammunition production. The introduction of steel in ammunition manufacturing greatly reduced the cost of ammunition. However, by the beginning of World War II, production was still mostly in brass, and the start of the conflict halted any attempt to change the production system to a greater extent. The factories couldn't stop. In any case, the cost reduction eventually allowed the Soviets to manufacture large quantities of ammunition at a relatively low price. There's a very curious account I found about the Battle of Kursk in the rear. Right before the troops advanced, there was a massive barrage from hundreds of artillery pieces and hundreds of mortars to soften up the German defenses. The barrage lasted 45 minutes, during which 45 trainloads of ammunition were used. Each train had 60 cars, each carrying between 10 and 16 tons of ammunition. In total, 27,000 tons of ammunition were sent, 27 times the weight of the Eiffel Tower. The Soviet Union produced so much ammunition that it could afford such displays of power. At that time, the Soviet Army mainly used only two types of ammunition, the 7.62 2x54 for rifles, and the 7.62 2x25 millimeters for pistols and their submachine guns. But this was about to change. By 1943, the Soviet Army was looking to create an intermediate cartridge to start developing a wide range of rifles and carbines. It would be none other than the 7.62 2x39mm, the cartridge that the Automat Kalashnikova 47 would use. This new and cutting-edge cartridge would be produced with new steel production techniques. For example, its projectile was coated in steel, and by the 1960s it would be the first to have a case made entirely of steel. After World War II, steel continued to become cheaper, making ammunition production, instead of returning to brass, mostly done in steel. Later, 5.45 x39mm ammo, which replaced the Automat Kalashnikova 47 at 7.62 x39 APA, was also made entirely of steel. They could come with a steel core and brass coating, or with a lead core and steel coating. Ammunition of all calibers would undergo this evolution to steel, and likewise, this material took over almost the entire ammunition production in the Soviet Union. And so it would be in the latter half of the 20th century. However, there were also alternatives. In addition to steel cases, there were cartridges with bimetallic cases made from steel and copper. As a result, you'll notice that in addition to the green cartridges, there were also traditional ones with colors reminiscent of Western ammunition. Projectiles like the 5.45 x39 would be remembered by the unfortunate armies that the Soviets faced as poisoned ammunition. The Afghans during the Soviet campaign in Afghanistan would come up with this nickname, poisoned ammunition. The 5.45 was much more devastating than the 7.62 ml. The steel ammunition, instead of deforming, would break apart upon impact with the body, creating fragments like shrapnel inside the body, being harder and traveling. 200 meters per second faster than its predecessor, it created much larger cavities, particularly about 44% larger. Also, since it fragmented inside the body, it was difficult to remove all the shrapnel. So if you were treated in a field hospital, infections were really common. Did you have steel rusting inside your body? The nickname poisoned bullet was very fitting. But what are the differences between a steel cartridge and a brass one? Which one is better? There really wasn't much difference. The weight was similar, but when it came to durability, things changed quite a bit. In fact, traditional storage of brass casings wreaked havoc on Soviet steel ammunition, making their durability very questionable. So storage in the 1930s had to be very refined to achieve the success of this ammunition. The ammunition was stored in steel boxes, which the soldiers nicknamed zinc boxes because they were galvanized. Later on, even though they were painted, the name stuck. This nickname makes you think the boxes were actually made of zinc, but in reality they were just steel. Also, the boxes had nitrogen inside instead of air, protecting the ammunition from oxidation. The ammunition inside these boxes can last up to a century. When opening the airtight box, the ammunition still had the same durability as brass ones. And also, since they had a special varnish, the ammunition outside the boxes was even more protected from oxidation. Obviously, not for as long as inside the nitrogen container, but it gave them acceptable durability for combat. In any case, if a squad opened a steel ammunition box in combat, it was very unlikely that the ammunition wouldn't be used in the short term, so there were never any problems with this. Do you remember I mentioned to you that the ammunition was lacquered so it could withstand both temperature and oxidation? Well, this varnish is what gives the cartridges their greenish appearance. Today, making ammunition from steel isn't necessary. Brass production is stable in Russia. However, Soviet ammunition still prevails since their factories are still working perfectly, and it would be a major investment to convert them to produce brass ammunition. And anyway, these munitions are simply historic. Have you ever wondered why Soviet magazines are orange? Well, click on the video in the center to find out. Thank you very much for this video, and goodbye.